So what we thought we'd do, the way when we were planning the session between Keith, between Glenn, Mark and I, we had a view that actually it'd probably be useful for me maybe to set the scene of, well, how did we get here, and then Mark, tail end of the day, do the one leading into the debate. So I said, yeah, I'll do the first bit, let's get started on this. How did we get here? And it's actually pulling the slides together, looking at this, I find quite an interesting process as well, but also it'd be interesting to just pick up some of your examples that are coming through. I think one of the things interesting is the way that data is used, the way that information is processed has changed radically over the last 30, 40, 50 years. We used to have mainframes where everything was in one box, and it was all very, very contained. And we had card indexes, must take it as well, but it was fairly contained. We then started to actually move into microcomputers, PCs. We had a slightly more connected world. And then we got this thing called the internet, cloud computing, mobile devices, software as a service, lots of providers, and suddenly the world got a lot more complicated. And I think that is partly why we are where we are at the moment, because legislation and what we're trying to do is trying to keep up with the way the world is developing. Where does it all come from? One of the things I found interesting was the fact that if you go back to where did all the data protection law come from, actually it comes from the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there's some key phrases there, particularly where no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home or correspondence. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion or expression. So there's already some very early statements there about the fact that you as an individual have a right to some privacy. It then goes through into the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights, which kind of puts the same words in a slightly different order, but also it starts to add in the view about what public authorities, what governments to do, and some of the tones and the inference here is that all the organisations are okay, it's the people you need to worry about are the governments. We then get sort of through the 1960s through to the 1980s, various countries were introducing their own data protection legislation. We then enter the OECD, which comes up with guidelines on the protection of privacy and transborder flows of personal data. They've got a whole lot of principles there. The word principles, some of these have developed and evolved and moved on as the legislation has moved on, but it's quite interesting to see how some of what we see there from 1980 is still very much underpins the legislation today. Then we got the 1995 Directive, which became the Data Protection Act 1998. 8 key principles there, again, very familiar principles you see there. But this was very much about the organisations in the EU. So the shift seemed to be going from very much being about governments and what governments were doing with it to what businesses and organisations were doing with personal data. And we then get to this thing called GDPR. Now these two slides were ones I borrowed from the Information Commission's office from when they presented last year. But actually, 2 slides very neatly put all the 8 principles and does the display and also includes the accountability principle. So again, it's shifted again from being purely about focused on businesses in the EU to now about data about individuals within the EU, which is why the Americans and others are starting to become caught in the net. So why does it all matter? Now, let's see, put our hands up. Anybody not had an email asking them to sign up, to re-sign up, to get their consent for something? No? We've all had quite a few of those. Out of interest, how many of you have had emails coming through that were for organisations where you think it might have been phishing, where you never signed up with them and they're trying to get rid of it? Yeah, interesting. So there's been a lot of media frenzy, a lot of fuss, a lot of froth in the media, a lot of panic, a lot of scare stories. Is it more relevant? Does it matter? This is an example of an email. This is a text from an email received in February of this year, which I find interesting. I'd be interested to get some of your examples of where things are a bit strange. This was a recruiter contacting me. Never heard of this recruiter before. And bearing in mind, I'm doing a lot of work as a data management consultant, large enterprise organisations. Before that, worked at Severn Trent Water, quite a senior position there. So this is one where they're looking at, this is like a developer role in Colville in Leicestershire, which, I don't know if you know Colville, it's not glamorous, but it's pretty safe. Offering competitive salary of 20 to 25k. There is a note there of, I may not have your most up-to-date profile, so apologies if the role is not of interest. And I thought, actually, this is so far off the mark. I want to challenge this. So I found out who the MD was, mailed the MD, copying this Jessica in, who Jessica is, saying, I think you've got a problem here. Can I have a subject access request, please? So he said, we'll pay £10 and we'll tell you. But fill in this form so we know what's come from. The form gave me the clue as to where it all came from, because it included a list of about 30-odd recruitment organisations. One name I recognised, and I provided my CV to them in 2006, maybe slightly earlier. So there we are, 12 years on, still using the same information, assuming it's still up to date or broadly up to date. Anybody else have similar examples? Yeah, typical. Now, you've all heard of, well, you should all have heard of Cambridge Analytica. I think most people have. How many of you, quick show of hands, anybody heard of the Deep Root Analytics breach?
So again, the
Deep Root Analytics, their data breach. No hands. Now, this is an interesting one. This organisation, Deep Root Analytics, they gathered information on 198 million US voters, put it in a data warehouse, 1.1 terabytes of data, and they got it on. The data warehouse was public facing on the web, and it wasn't password protected. Anybody could get access to it. In fact, somebody did, and they pulled out, and if you look at the field names there, there's some very interesting field names in there. So you've got not just name, address, date of birth, you have modelled ethnicity, modelled religion, modelled ethnic group. So they had done some modelling to try and infer what your religion was and your ethnic background. They'd also got in there about whether they could bring the right to a phone. Also, the midterm 2010 elections, what they thought the turnout was, what they thought your view of alarm was. And all that on the web, public accessible. Interestingly, that hasn't received the same amount of media fuss as Cambridge Analytica. Because arguably that's probably slightly deeper than what Cambridge Analytica did, but maybe not quite as broad. Possibly Facebook, nice target, everyone should go to Facebook. So that might have been the issue, that it was US politics this bit. Google. Has anybody taken the time to look at some of the stuff that Google has about you? So if you go in your Google dashboard, there's some example of mine here, you can see some of the stuff that you've got set up there. And bear in mind that typically I don't use Google as my search engine. I don't use Chrome as my browser. I only use Gmail for limited amounts of information. What I did find interesting was being able to see one of the categories at the top and bottom of the screen was voice searches. So when I got my first Android phone, I thought, let's try this voice search thing. So I was able to play back the audio recording of the voice search that I made 6-7 years ago. Interesting what they've got with this. What's also interesting is if you look at your Google timeline. So those blobs is where Google thinks you have been in the world. And I looked at those, and quite a few of them recognised: Germany, Belgium, Italy. Durham, I thought, I think I've been to Durham. I had. Those are the routes I took. That was when I drove. Those were the breaks I took. It was where I thought I parked. And my brakes on the way back. So yes, we went to see Northumbrian Water, didn't we? And we parked in the Sainsbury's car park next to the filling station, which is where they thought we were. I don't use Google Maps in my sat-nav. I use Waze. So it's interesting what data they've got.
Interestingly, they even track you if you switch up. If you're off roaming,
Yeah.
they track by GDPR.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about Google is if you've got an Android phone, I don't know if Apple's the same, I'm not on the dark side, I'm a different dark side. You look at the location tracking, it offers you GPS or high accuracy mode. High accuracy mode will use Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So how does that work? Well, it knows where lots of Wi-Fi hotspots are, it knows where lots of Bluetooth devices are, and that's how it gets more accurate. So they've got a lot of data about us. Interesting. Another one, just switching track slightly, if you think, I mean, GDPR, it's been in the headlines for quite a long time. There's been quite a bit of fuss. This is Google Trends. It's a useful site, Google. It's got lots of information there. Sorry, I'll skip very briefly back to that one. I think the only benefit I can think of for having all that stuff for us as an individual is if you have a situation where somebody's cloned your car number plate, or you've got a fraudulent parking claim that you says you parked your car here. That's about the only benefit for you as an individual. Most of the benefits are to Google, of course, because they give the service for free. You're giving them data so they can provide you adverts. Anyway, Google Trends, it looks at popularity of search terms. This is GDPR. So there was a massive great spike in around 20th of May. Interestingly, it's dropped straight off again. What is also interesting, I do want to probably question Google's data on this one, is where are the countries, which geographies were most interested in GDPR? Top of the list, Jersey, Czech Republic, St. Helena, Malta, Luxembourg. So, yeah, there's something there which isn't quite right, but we'll see. Another one, there's perceptions that, and I've gone through a lot of this, of the fact that GDPR, it is quite interesting when you think about it. It's only a logical extension of what we've done before. Somebody had the bright idea of coming up with a podcast, which was the man who reads the shipping forecast, reading the GDPR regulations. And as he turned at the top there, it's the auditory equivalent of the sedative required to take down an insomniac rhinoceros that's just down the Red Bull espresso. Now, I didn't actually read the whole 57,509 words, but he does a 34-minute version of it. But it just kind of shows some of the media attention that GDPR has been raising. What about, have you got examples of other things you think, actually, this is a really good example why we need data protection regulations?
I think the data that Tesco, Sainsbury's have about us is unbelievable. The level of data and the analysis that they make about that data is actually very frank. I tried to unsubscribe all my data on Sainsbury's about a week ago, and I had no process in place to do it.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. In fact, you've probably been looking at my next slide, I think, haven't you? Possibly, we'll see. So I thought, okay, let's do a bit of ranking, a bit of thinking, a bit of getting people to think about how much do you trust different organisations. How much for our personal data do we trust the government, the police, GCHQ, and the NSA? You could argue, government IT being government IT, the chance of them joining all the dots to put together actually might not be that strong. But then again, the government has actually, in some ways, they have a security role, so you think actually they should be keeping some form of monitoring on who we are and what we do. So trust levels probably higher maybe than other organisations. What about Apple, Google? Just giving you some examples there of Google, the kind of data that Google does. Amazon and Microsoft. They all know a lot about us and what we do and where we go. How much do we trust them with that information? Do you trust Microsoft more than Amazon, more than Google? Good question. Test it out. What about people like financial institutions, NatWest, Barclays, HSBC, Visa, MasterCard? They know where you spend money. They know what you spend money on, so they can infer quite a bit about you from your spending patterns. But there is also an element of trust that goes both ways. They trust you to do the right things. You trust the bank to do the right things with your money. So trust there probably is quite a bit higher. What about your mobile phone provider? So that device that sits there and the roaming service, they know roughly where you've been from where this phone is. They know the calls you made, who you've spoken to, how long those calls were. They probably don't have an audio transcript of everything. Who knows? Getting on to the retail one. Tesco, Asda, Morrison's, Sainsbury's, Waitrose. Who of those do you trust with your data? What about Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp, King, people who do Candy Crush Saga, and all those other things? One of the interesting presentations we've had here has been when the chap from Exasol has come and explained about some of the data engines they use behind what goes on with Candy Crush Saga. And when they explain about the mechanics there, about how they monitor your activity to keep you in the game. They don't want you stopping playing Candy Crush. So they play around with the probabilities to make it easier.